Was it really just an accident? In the coastal town of Hawthorne Bay, a place known for its picturesque sunsets and serene waters, a tragedy had unfolded that no one saw coming. It was supposed to be the happiest of nights. Adam Mitchell and Lena Carter, two young lovers, had just exchanged vows, promising a lifetime of love in front of friends and family. The air was thick with joy, the night warm and full of laughter. Their wedding had been perfect, a moment many dream of, and after the ceremony, the newlyweds climbed into a decorated golf cart, ready to leave the venue. The tin cans trailing behind them, the "just married" sign fluttering in the breeze, the couple made their way down the quiet, winding road. But by morning, everything had changed. Lena was dead. Adam was fighting for his life. A crash, violent, unforgiving, had shattered their celebration. The golf cart, fragile and small, stood no chance against the powerful force of an oncoming SUV speeding down the road at 70 miles per hour. The driver, Kelsey Thompson, was intoxicated, her blood alcohol level 3 times over the legal limit. The vehicle collided with the couple's golf cart, sending them both hurtling into the night. Lena's life was taken, her dreams extinguished in an instant. Adam, battered and broken, was left clinging to life in a hospital bed. But was it really just an accident? Detective Shannon Drake sat at her desk, the case file open in front of her. The details were stark. A drunk driver, a crash, a life lost. And yet, something didn't sit right. She had seen her share of accidents, but this one, it felt different. Kelsey Thompson, the driver, was known to the police. A local woman with a history of reckless behavior, she was the prime suspect. But Drake's instincts told her there was more to this story. Why had Kelsey been at the wedding in the first place? What was her connection to the bride and groom? And what about the timing? How had it happened that just before the crash, witnesses had seen Kelsey and Lena speaking, exchanging words no one had remembered until after the wreck? The pieces didn't fit together. Kelsey was the obvious target, but Drake couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was being left unsaid. She glanced at the photo of Adam Mitchell, still unconscious in the hospital, fighting for a life that had been ripped away in an instant. Adam had lost everything, his wife, his future, and perhaps, soon, his own sanity. But even as he lay in the hospital, unable to speak, he was the key to understanding what really happened that night. If only he could remember. The case had the outward appearance of a simple drunk driving accident. But the more Drake read, the more she felt a deeper mystery unfolding. Every detail, every witness account seemed to hint at something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. What was Kelsey doing there? How deep did the tension between her and the newlyweds run? What had happened that no one had realized until the tragedy struck? Was this really just an accident? The answers would come, but not yet. Hawthorne Bay, a small town that seemed untouched by the dark clouds that were now gathering overhead. At its heart, this was the story of 3 people. Lena Carter, a young woman with a bright future, Adam Mitchell, her husband, whose life had been shattered in an instant, and Kelsey Thompson, the woman who, on a fateful night, took everything from them. And then there was Detective Shannon Drake, whose job it was to unravel the tangled web of this tragedy. But before the wreckage, before the alcohol and the crash, there were lives that, for a brief moment, intersected in ways no one could have predicted. And it was these lives, their histories, their dreams, and their secrets that would ultimately drive the investigation forward. Lena Carter had always been a woman on the move. Born and raised in the bustling city of Chicago, she had big dreams that seemed to outgrow her modest beginnings. A quick-witted, ambitious woman, Lena moved to Hawthorne Bay seeking a simpler life. Drawn to the charm of the coastal town and the promise of new opportunities, she had found love in Adam Mitchell, a kind-hearted man whose quiet strength matched her boldness. Together, they built a life that was a perfect blend of city sophistication and small-town tranquility. Her friends described her as the kind of person who lit up a room. Lena was not just beautiful, she was driven, with a charisma that pulled people in. She had plans, big plans, plans that included a career in the arts, a house filled with children, and a future with Adam that stretched out before her like an endless horizon. But all of that had been taken from her in a heartbeat. Lena's death wasn't just a loss for Adam, it was a blow to the entire town. People couldn't understand how someone so full of promise, someone so full of life, could be taken away so violently, so suddenly. Her funeral was an outpouring of grief, a testament to the love and respect she had earned in her short life. But the question still lingered. Why? What happened that night? Adam Mitchell, the grieving husband, the broken man. He had always been a quiet man. He wasn't one to seek the spotlight, and he certainly wasn't one to make waves. But when he met Lena, something inside him awakened. With her, Adam felt seen, understood, and for the first time in his life, truly loved. Together, they had made plans, big ones. They were going to build a life full of adventure, family, and joy. Their wedding was supposed to be the beginning of that dream, but Adam's world had come crashing down. Lena was dead, and Adam, barely alive, was left behind to pick up the pieces. His body was broken, his mind fractured, and his heart was torn to pieces. The doctors didn't know if Adam would make it, but what no one could account for was the devastation inside him, a pain so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. But Adam couldn't remember what had happened that night. His mind was a blur of pain and confusion. The last thing he remembered was leaving the wedding with Lena, their hands entwined, their future ahead of them. The crash, the moments before the crash, they were gone, lost in the fog of his injuries. What Adam didn't know, what no one knew, was that his life was about to become even more complicated. The investigation was only beginning, and as the truth started to surface, Adam would find himself facing questions he wasn't ready to answer. Kelsey Thompson, the villain or the victim? Kelsey Thompson had always been a local enigma. Born and raised in Hawthorne Bay, she was a woman with a reputation, one that preceded her wherever she went. She wasn't known for being a troublemaker, but she wasn't exactly a saint either. Her past was littered with a series of bad decisions, poor judgment, and a number of run-ins with the law. Kelsey had a reputation for partying hard, for being reckless, for making poor choices. But no one had ever expected her to be at the wedding that night. She didn't know Lena personally, but she had known Adam. They had shared a few nights out together, a few drinks, a few laughs. It wasn't anything serious, but Kelsey had always been drawn to Adam. He was kind, charming, easy to talk to, but he was taken, off limits. Kelsey never saw him that way, though. To her, he was just another guy, another opportunity to fill the emptiness she had been chasing for years. When Kelsey showed up at the wedding, no one thought much of it. A few people noticed her, sure, but the focus was on the bride and groom, as it should be. But Kelsey wasn't there just to celebrate. No, she was there to drink, to escape her own troubles, to find something, anything, to make her feel alive again. And when she got behind the wheel of her SUV, it wasn't the alcohol that made her reckless. It was something deeper, something darker, something she couldn't explain. The crash happened, and Kelsey was arrested at the scene. She walked away with scratches and bruises, but Lena was dead, and Adam was fighting for his life. Kelsey had been the one driving, but was she the one to blame? What had driven her to make that fateful decision? Was it the alcohol, or was there more to her actions than anyone realized? And then there was Detective Shannon Drake. A seasoned investigator, Drake had seen it all, or so she thought. The young woman with the sharp mind and a quiet determination had been with the Hawthorne Bay Police Department for nearly a decade. She had a reputation for solving cases others couldn't touch, but this case, felt different. From the moment the call came in, Shannon knew there was something more to this crash than met the eye. Kelsey Thompson was the obvious suspect. She was drunk. She had caused the accident. End of story, right? But as Shannon dug deeper into the case, she began to realize that there were too many questions, too many inconsistencies. Kelsey was hiding something, and Shannon could feel it. What made Kelsey crash? Why had she been at the wedding? Why had she been talking to Lena? Was there something between them that no one had uncovered yet? As the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, Shannon became more and more convinced that there was something much bigger at play, something that was buried deep beneath the surface, hidden in the shadows. But Shannon wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. Lena deserved justice. Adam deserved answers. And Kelsey? Kelsey needed to be held accountable for whatever role she played in the tragedy. As the investigation unfolded, Shannon began to see the tangled web that connected these three people. Lena, the innocent victim whose life was taken so suddenly. Adam, the grieving husband who had lost everything. Kelsey, the woman whose reckless actions had shattered their lives. And Shannon, the detective who had become determined to uncover the truth. But as the days passed, Shannon realized that the simple answers were slipping through her fingers. Every lead led to more questions. Every piece of evidence uncovered only seemed to complicate the case further. What had happened on that fateful night? Who was truly to blame? The answers were there, hidden in the dark corners of their lives, and Shannon Drake would find them, no matter what it took. It was supposed to be the happiest night of their lives, but instead, it ended in tragedy. Kelsey was an easy suspect, yes, but there were layers to this case that were begging to be uncovered. Detective Drake began her investigation by speaking with witnesses who had been at the wedding. There were whispers of strange behavior, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on new meaning. Kelsey had been seen talking to Lena just before the crash. Their conversation appeared tense, though no one could recall the details of what was said. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? Was there something more to their exchange than met the eye? The detective's questions grew more pressing as she dug deeper. Kelsey's involvement at the wedding raised more questions than answers. What had happened in the moments leading up to the crash? Was there something that had set Kelsey off? Or was her reckless driving a result of something entirely different? And then there was Adam, his life hanging in the balance, his mind unable to grasp the enormity of what had occurred. He had lost Lena, the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. The detectives had little to go on from him. His injuries were too severe for him to give any clear answers. His memories, if he had any, were clouded by the trauma. Detective Shannon Drake stood at the scene of the crash, looking down at the wreckage. The answers were still elusive. Everyone thought they knew what had happened, but the deeper she looked, the more questions arose. There was no doubt that Kelsey had caused the crash. Her blood alcohol level made that much clear, but why had she been there in the first place? Why had she been driving? And why had her actions led to such a devastating outcome? The investigation was just beginning, and already it was clear that nothing was as straightforward as it appeared. What seemed like a tragic accident was beginning to look more and more like something far more complicated. There were pieces missing, and Detective Drake was determined to find them. The story of that night, of the crash that had taken Lena's life and left Adam fighting for his, was only just starting to unfold. But already it was clear that this wasn't a simple case, and the truth behind what happened that night would be far harder to uncover than anyone had imagined. The questions were mounting. The answers, however, remained elusive. Detective Shannon Drake spent the next few days following the trail that had so far led nowhere concrete. Every new piece of evidence raised more doubts than it answered. Kelsey Thompson's statements, the crash site, the timeline, it all seemed straightforward at first. But as Drake dug deeper, the threads began to unravel. It was clear that Kelsey had been drinking at the wedding, but the more people Drake spoke to, the more inconsistencies began to appear. Was Kelsey's involvement in the wedding party truly a coincidence? Or was there more to her presence than she had let on? The fact that no one had questioned her being there at the time of the crash only added to Drake's suspicion. Drake took a closer look at the wedding guest list. A connection between Kelsey and the couple wasn't immediately obvious. Yet, the more she pressed, the more gaps appeared. Kelsey was known to have been at several bars in the area before the wedding, but she wasn't a close friend of the bride or groom. She had no official invitation, but had been added to the list at the last minute by one of the groom's friends. What had Kelsey been doing at the wedding, if not to celebrate the couple's union? Drake's thoughts were interrupted when the lab results from Kelsey's blood alcohol level came in. Her blood alcohol level had been 3 times the legal limit at the time of the crash. The results painted a picture of someone unable to operate a vehicle safely, let alone drive at high speeds down a narrow road. But Kelsey's demeanor in her initial interviews made it clear that she wasn't fully accepting the gravity of the situation. Something didn't add up. The town's residents were not so quick to judge Kelsey. As the weeks passed, many people began to express sympathy for her. She made a mistake, they said. We all do. Who hasn't been there? That sentiment grew, despite the damning evidence. After all, Kelsey was a local, and the crash was a horrible accident. The idea that someone could truly want to harm Lena or Adam seemed unthinkable to most. But Detective Drake knew better. As the investigation continued, the questions about Kelsey's motives grew louder. She was hiding something. And the more Drake listened to the local gossip, the more she realized that the answers weren't going to be handed to her easily. Drake's second round of questioning with Kelsey was even more revealing. There was no outburst, no anger, just a blank, almost distant demeanor. Kelsey's eyes betrayed no real regret, just a quiet, cold recognition of the damage done. When asked about her presence at the wedding, Kelsey's answers were vague. "I was just having a good time. I didn't know anyone too well, but Lena was nice. I had a few drinks like everyone else. I wasn't driving, I swear, but my friend left, and I ended up behind the wheel." That night, she had left the wedding venue not long before the crash, a decision that would haunt her forever. Yet the way she spoke, the calmness in her voice, made Drake question whether Kelsey truly understood the extent of the harm she had caused. Her remorse didn't feel as genuine as it should have been, but there was something else lurking beneath her responses, something in her tone, the subtle shifts in her eyes. Drake couldn't shake the sense that Kelsey wasn't being truthful about what had really happened that night. Could it be that the alcohol wasn't the only thing clouding Kelsey's judgment? Could there have been something else driving her? The contradictions were mounting. Guests who had seen Kelsey speak with Lena before the crash couldn't recall the specifics, but they noted that the two women had been involved in what looked like a heated conversation. A few guests mentioned that Lena had appeared upset, though no one could explain why. Was Kelsey and Lena's interaction really just a casual exchange, or had there been something more to it? Something more personal? Theories about jealousy, old grudges, and undisclosed relationships began to swirl in the air. Drake knew the case was far from over. Kelsey's story didn't sit right. Her dispassionate demeanor didn't match the grief she should have been feeling. As she reviewed the notes from the latest interrogation, a chilling realization began to take shape. The truth was far from simple, and Kelsey wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Drake's frustration mounted as she faced the cold reality of the case. The evidence was there, but it was all too neat, too tidy. In a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, Drake knew that appearances could be deceptive. What seemed like an open and shut case was beginning to show cracks. Every lead seemed to offer a new question without an answer. Every interview added another layer of doubt. The more Drake learned about Kelsey, the more she realized how little she truly knew. How far back did this web of connections go? What role had Kelsey really played in the events leading up to the crash? And, most importantly, who was pulling the strings? The tension in the air was undeniable. Detective Shannon Drake felt it each time she walked into the interrogation room, each time she studied Kelsey Thompson's face. The young woman seemed to shift between emotions, carefully calculated calmness, fleeting frustration, and what looked like genuine confusion, but never the raw sorrow or regret that should have followed such a tragic event. Kelsey was holding something back, and Shannon was beginning to feel the weight of it. It wasn't the first time Shannon had dealt with a suspect who was playing the game of innocence. But there was something different about Kelsey. A subtle energy in the way she responded to questions. A quiet defiance behind every answer, as though she believed the entire town would eventually take her side. The case was a wrecking ball to Kelsey's life, yet she wasn't showing the cracks that would have come with guilt. No trembling hands, no tears, no remorse, just a cold demeanor that seemed as rehearsed as a scripted apology. Shannon had heard the whispers from the people who knew Kelsey best, her co-workers, old friends, the people who drank with her at the local bars. Some claimed she'd been troubled for years, her wild tendencies growing increasingly reckless. Others mentioned a sharp temper, a tendency to snap when things didn't go her way. All the while, Kelsey's behavior remained eerily calm, a demeanor Shannon couldn't quite reconcile with the situation. One afternoon, Shannon made her way to Kelsey's apartment. The small unit had a sparse, functional feel to it. No personal touches, no signs of a life well lived, just the bare necessities. Kelsey greeted Shannon with a polite but distant smile, offering no resistance when asked for a brief chat. Shannon studied her movements closely, how her eyes darted away when questioned about the night of the wedding. It was subtle, but it was there. When Shannon asked Kelsey to recount the events of the night in detail again, Kelsey's story remained remarkably unchanged. She had been at the wedding, she had drunk too much, and she had decided to leave when a friend gave her a ride to her car. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as Kelsey spoke, Shannon couldn't shake the feeling that the details didn't fit. The timing, the places Kelsey had been, didn't align with the simple narrative she was telling. "Were you alone when you left?" Shannon asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Yes," Kelsey responded immediately. But there was hesitation before the word left her mouth, a slight stutter, a crack. Shannon's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure about that? Because someone mentioned they saw you speaking with Lena just before the crash." Kelsey's eyes flickered. Then, with a forced smile, she answered, "We talked briefly. She seemed fine. I don't know why anyone would say that. We were just being polite." The deflection was too easy, too smooth. Shannon could feel her suspicion deepen. Kelsey was dancing around something, but what? Back at the precinct, Shannon went over the evidence once again. The footage from the local bar had just come in. Footage that showed Kelsey, along with a few other guests, drinking heavily before the wedding. What struck Shannon wasn't just how much Kelsey had consumed, it was the way she interacted with people. It wasn't the carefree behavior of someone celebrating, it was the behavior of someone who was trying too hard to fit in, to pretend like everything was fine. Shannon also received the final autopsy report on Lena Carter. The report stated that Lena had a significant amount of alcohol in her system, but not nearly as much as Kelsey. However, the real detail that caught Shannon's eye was the bruising on Lena's arms, a pattern that suggested a struggle, a fight before the crash, or something more. Shannon couldn't ignore the mounting contradictions. If Kelsey was just a drunken driver, why hadn't she mentioned the altercation with Lena? Why had no one else from the wedding seen it? Was Kelsey covering up more than just her poor choices behind the wheel? The pressure was mounting, and as Shannon sifted through the evidence, her gut told her something more was going on. She knew she was close to the truth, but it was elusive, like a puzzle that refused to be solved. Shannon decided it was time for another round of questioning. This time, her questions were sharper, more direct. Kelsey sat in front of her, but the subtle tension in the air was different now. Kelsey's usual calm was wearing thin. "I've been looking into your background, Kelsey," Shannon began, her voice low but firm, "and I know there are things you've kept quiet about." Kelsey's posture stiffened, but she didn't speak. "You weren't exactly a saint, were you?" Shannon continued, her gaze never leaving Kelsey's face. "I've heard about the trouble you caused in the past, the fights, the arguments. But what I'm more concerned about is why you're lying about Lena. You and I both know that something went down before the crash. Something more than you're telling me." Kelsey's mouth twitched slightly. Then, in a low voice, she muttered, "You don't know what you're talking about." Shannon's eyes hardened. "I think I do. You've been hiding something, Kelsey, and I'm going to find out what it is." There it was, the first real crack in Kelsey's facade. Her breath quickened, her hands clenched. Shannon could feel it. The moment Kelsey knew she was no longer in control of the situation. The game had changed. Kelsey wasn't just playing the victim anymore. Shannon had seen it. The subtle shift in Kelsey's behavior, the deliberate way she was spinning her version of events. There was a tactic there, something manipulative in the way she moved through the questioning, as if she knew exactly how to turn the conversation to her advantage. And in that moment, Shannon understood the full weight of the investigation. This wasn't just about a drunk driver or a tragic accident. It was about control. Kelsey was trying to maintain control over the narrative, to shift blame where it didn't belong. Kelsey's eyes never left Shannon's, but for the first time, Shannon saw fear behind them. The fear of being cornered. The fear of having her secrets exposed. Shannon didn't need to speak. She didn't need to say anything. She simply stared at Kelsey, letting the silence do its work. And it was in that silence that the truth began to claw its way to the surface. The case was reaching a critical point. With every step Shannon took, Kelsey seemed to react, her composure slipping just enough to show that she was hiding something far deeper than anyone could have guessed. The investigation had shifted from a simple car accident to something much more layered, and Kelsey was at the center of it all. As Shannon pieced together the fragments, the cat-and-mouse dynamic was growing sharper. Kelsey was losing her grip. Shannon was closing in. And as the walls began to close in on Kelsey, the tension between them reached its peak. As Shannon starts to uncover contradictions in Kelsey's behavior and pushes her closer to revealing the truth. The suspense builds as Kelsey's manipulations become more apparent and Shannon's determination grows. The investigation, once passive, shifts into an active pursuit of the truth, with both sides becoming increasingly aware of the stakes. The investigation had been methodical, progressing slowly but surely. Detective Shannon Drake had worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence. She thought she had a clear understanding of the events leading up to that fateful night. Kelsey Thompson was the one behind the wheel, drunk, reckless, and with a troubling history. It all seemed so straightforward, yet there was an undercurrent she couldn't quite shake. Something felt off. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was not from the usual sources. There were no new statements from witnesses, no stunning confessions. Instead, it came from an unexpected phone call, a tip from a source that Shannon hadn't anticipated, an ex-boyfriend of Kelsey's named James Fields. James Fields had reached out through a private number, and his voice on the other end of the line was cautious, tinged with both fear and curiosity. At first, Shannon was hesitant. She had no reason to trust this man, who claimed to know Kelsey intimately, but had long since faded from the scene. But as he continued to speak, the details he offered gave Shannon pause. His voice, quiet but urgent, told a different story than what she had been chasing. "I know you're investigating Kelsey," James said, his words coming out in a rush. "And I need you to hear this. She didn't just crash into that car. She wasn't alone when she left the bar, and I think she's hiding something." Shannon's eyes narrowed as she listened to James recount events from months earlier, long before the wedding night. He described Kelsey's behavior after a nasty breakup, the emotional toll it had taken on her, and the dark side that had always lurked beneath her seemingly calm exterior. James spoke of secretive encounters, strange late-night phone calls, and Kelsey's growing anxiety as she talked about Lena Carter. It wasn't just a random crash. It wasn't just alcohol. James had seen it firsthand, the bitter rivalry that had quietly been simmering between Kelsey and Lena for months. Kelsey had been obsessed with Lena's life, the perfect life that she could never have. Lena had it all, the loving husband, the dream wedding, the future ahead of her. Kelsey, in contrast, was struggling with demons, addictions, failed relationships, and a history of feeling overlooked and rejected. This was the twist that Shannon hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the crash. It was about jealousy, resentment, and something more. According to James, Kelsey had been obsessed with Lena long before the wedding. She had resented Lena's attention from Adam. It wasn't just alcohol clouding Kelsey's judgment that night. It was something far deeper. As Shannon processed the new information, she began to piece together the behavior of the people closest to the case. Kelsey hadn't just been drinking at the bar, she had been drinking to numb the anger that had been brewing for weeks. And when Lena had stepped into the spotlight of the wedding, that was the final straw. James revealed something that sent chills down Shannon's spine. He claimed that Kelsey had threatened to ruin Lena's life before the wedding. It was a vague statement, and Shannon couldn't confirm its authenticity just yet, but it was enough to raise more questions than answers. Was Kelsey's crash truly an accident? Or had it been an intentional act, born from a bitter resentment that Kelsey had never been able to control? The revelation hit Shannon hard. She had been so sure of Kelsey's innocence, so focused on the reckless drunk driver narrative, that she hadn't considered the possibility of premeditated malice. The pieces were falling into place, but in a way she hadn't expected. Shannon sat back in her office, the case files scattered across the desk before her. The weight of the new information began to sink in. Kelsey's actions hadn't been the result of a tragic mistake. They had been the culmination of years of unresolved issues, jealousy, and rage. But now, the stakes were higher. Shannon was no longer just looking at a drunk driving case. She was dealing with the possibility of something much darker, an act of deliberate harm disguised as an accident. As Shannon pieced together the fragments, the cat-and-mouse dynamic was growing sharper. Kelsey was losing her grip. Shannon was closing in. And as the walls began to close in on Kelsey, the tension between them reached its peak. Shannon leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. That's what you want people to believe, isn't it? But we both know there's more to this. You weren't just drunk. You were angry. You hated her. You were obsessed with her. Kelsey shifted in her chair, the walls of her carefully crafted defense beginning to show cracks. Her fingers drummed lightly on the tabletop, an unconscious sign of the agitation she was trying so hard to hide. I don't know what you're talking about, Kelsey said, but even Shannon could see the faintest tremor in her voice. I never hated her. I just wanted to be happy. You have no idea how it feels, always being in her shadow. Shannon's eyes remained fixed on Kelsey, her gaze unwavering. The detective could feel the walls closing in on Kelsey. Her tone was more measured now, sharper. Then why did you leave the bar with so much anger? Why did you threaten her, Kelsey? You said you were going to ruin her life. Do you remember that? At the mention of the threat, Kelsey's eyes darted away. She clenched her fists tightly, as though holding on to some semblance of control. But it was slipping, and she knew it. "You don't know anything about me," Kelsey muttered, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "You don't know what she did to me, what she took from me." Shannon sat back in her chair, letting the silence stretch between them. Kelsey was unraveling, and it was clear that the truth was within reach. The careful facade that Kelsey had maintained for so long was starting to crack, exposing the depth of her jealousy, the extent of her resentment. Shannon's mind raced as she put the final pieces of the puzzle together. Kelsey had always been a quiet presence at the wedding, but there had been more going on beneath the surface. The relationship between Lena and Kelsey wasn't just one of passing acquaintance. It was a tangled web of competition, bitterness, and obsession. Lena had unknowingly taken something from Kelsey, not just her husband-to-be Adam, but her sense of self-worth, her identity. Kelsey had always been overshadowed by Lena, always playing second fiddle, always the one left behind. Lena was everything Kelsey wanted to be. Beautiful, successful, desired by everyone around her. Adam had loved Lena deeply, but there had been moments, subtle moments, when Kelsey thought he might just look her way. A glance here, a compliment there, the kind of fleeting attention that a person like Kelsey clung to for hope. But when Lena had stepped into the spotlight, first at the wedding and then as the perfect bride, Kelsey had finally cracked. Kelsey had always played the victim, but in that moment, when she saw Lena so happy, so perfect, Kelsey's resentment boiled over. She saw the wedding as the final affront, an insult she could never bear. "I didn't want her to have everything," Kelsey said, the words slipping out in a hushed whisper. "She had everything. I couldn't take it anymore." Shannon's heart sank as the full scope of Kelsey's actions became clear. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act, a reckless, vengeful response to the years of perceived slights, a culmination of everything Kelsey had felt she'd lost. Her jealousy had blinded her, and now Lena was dead. Shannon's voice grew sharper, more commanding. "So you followed her. You saw her leave with Adam, didn't you? And you followed them. You didn't just crash into them, Kelsey. You aimed for them. You wanted to take everything away from Lena. And you did." Kelsey's breath hitched, her face contorting with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't handle it. It was all too much. I wanted it to stop. I wanted her to stop. Everything she had, everything she was." There was a long pause as Kelsey's confession hung in the air. Shannon didn't move, didn't speak. The room was silent except for the faint sound of Kelsey's uneven breathing. Shannon could feel her pulse quicken as the magnitude of the moment sank in. Kelsey's motives had always been obscured, clouded by her own self-justification and denial. But now it was all clear. Kelsey had driven with purpose that night. The crash was no accident. It had been an act of destruction, an attempt to erase Lena and everything she represented. The detective stood up slowly, her face hardening as she looked at Kelsey one final time. The woman across from her was broken, but her actions were unmistakable. Kelsey had thrown away any chance of redemption the moment she decided to take matters into her own hands. "I think we're done here," Shannon said, her voice steady and cold. As the door closed behind her, Shannon felt a grim sense of finality. The investigation had reached its peak. The truth had been uncovered, and the consequences of Kelsey's rage would now be faced. Lena was gone, and Adam, though he would never be the same, would now have to carry the weight of her death for the rest of his life. The case was closed, but the echoes of that tragic night would continue to reverberate through Hawthorne Bay for years to come. Kelsey Thompson was arrested the day after her confession, the evidence against her overwhelming. It was hard to deny the truth when the pieces fit so perfectly into place. The authorities found the footage, security camera shots of her car following Adam and Lena's golf cart that night, the erratic turns, the deliberate speed, the crash, the anger in Kelsey's eyes as she slammed into the couple's vehicle. No longer could it be brushed aside as a tragic accident. Kelsey's trial was swift. The community's response was a mix of disbelief and sadness. In a small town like Hawthorne Bay, everyone knew everyone. Kelsey had once been a familiar face around town, a part of the fabric of the community. Now, she was a symbol of something darker, a reminder of how jealousy could twist a life into something unrecognizable. The courtroom was filled with the hushed murmurs of the town's residents as Kelsey sat at the defendant's table, her face impassive, her eyes cold and distant. She had no remorse, at least not in the way one might expect. It wasn't that she didn't understand the magnitude of her actions. It was that, to her, Lena's death had been a necessary evil. Justice would come, but it would never undo the damage she had inflicted. While Kelsey's fate was sealed, the true consequence of her actions would always remain with Lena's family. Lena's parents, her siblings, her entire family, had to learn how to live with the hole that had been left in their lives. Lena's mother, once a vibrant woman who had filled the Carter household with warmth, now moved through life in a daze. She couldn't understand how anyone could be so filled with bitterness that they would take her daughter's life. For Lena's father, a quiet man who had always been a rock for his family, the grief ran deeper than words could express. He never spoke of it aloud, but it was clear in his eyes. Lena's absence was a wound that would never heal. The funeral had been beautiful. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring Lena back. It didn't fill the space where she once stood, where her smile had once been a beacon of light. As the trial concluded and Kelsey was taken away in handcuffs, Shannon sat quietly at her desk in the small office at the police station. It had been a long, grueling few weeks, but she had done it. The case was closed. The truth was out. Kelsey would spend years in prison, and justice had been served. But even as Shannon considered that finality, a part of her couldn't shake the hollow feeling that lingered. This wasn't the outcome she had hoped for, and yet it was the only one that could have come. Kelsey was a woman twisted by her own rage and resentment, a woman who saw only the destruction of those she envied as the answer to her pain. Justice had been served, yes, but some things, once they were broken, could never be completely fixed. The case was closed, but in the hearts of those affected, it lingered.